Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a seriously fascinating piece of 7th century history involving the Quraysh tribe and the early Muslims. We're going to be looking at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Our sources describe this as a true watershed moment, like a total game changer. So let's unpack it.
Okay, I want you to hold this slightly paradoxical question in the back of your mind as we go through today's explainer. Can yielding in a negotiation actually guarantee your ultimate victory? See, we're analyzing a historical peace treaty that, honestly at the time, seemed to a lot of people like a massive one-sided defeat. But history reveals it was actually this brilliant masterstroke of diplomacy and strategic patience. To really understand how a perceived loss became a definitive triumph, we first got to understand the power players involved.
Section 1. Masters of Mecca Trade.
So, to set the stage, before the rise of Islam, the Quraysh were a settled Adnanite Arab tribe who basically controlled Mecca and the Kaaba, which back then was a major polytheistic sanctuary. They were unified by a leader named Qusay ibn Kilab, and they held immense regional power. Now, here's a fun fact. The Prophet Muhammad was actually born into a prominent clan of this exact tribe. But, initially they weren't quite the sprawling trading empire they would soon become. That changed pretty quickly. By the end of the 6th century, the Quraysh had evolved into this major Arabian trade hub. We're talking absolute economic dominance. They didn't just collect taxes from pilgrims anymore. They were actively running these highly organized winter caravans down to Yemen and summer caravans up to places like Gaza and Damascus. Our sources note that by 600 CE, they held a virtual regional monopoly. You had clans like the Banu Makhzum and Banu Umayyah building just massive wealth. They were operating less like your everyday merchants and a lot more like sophisticated financiers. They held the reins of political and economic power in the Hijaz region.
Section 2. The Clash with Islam.
Right, so when Prophet Muhammad began preaching Islam and directly challenging that prevalent Meccan polytheism, the Quraysh kind of brushed it off at first. But as his message spread, they started to see it as a huge threat, not just to their religious dominance, but, by extension, their incredibly lucrative economic interests. The tension eventually escalated into severe persecution. It got so bad that it led the Prophet and his early followers to migrate to Medina in 622 CE. That journey is known as the Hijra, and while they established a new base of support over in Medina, the conflict with Mecca was far, far from over.
What followed was literally years of grueling armed conflict. For the Muslims, it was fundamentally about survival. And a big part of that meant disrupting those rich Quraysh trade routes. The timeline really shows you how the stakes just kept escalating. In 624 CE, the outnumbered Muslims pulled off a massive victory at the Battle of Badr. But the Quraysh, obviously wanting to restore their honor, hit back hard in 625 CE at the Battle of Uhud and took the upper hand. Then, jumping to 627 CE, the Quraysh mobilized a massive army, we're talking 10,000 men, to besiege Medina in the Battle of the Trench. But, thanks to a literal defensive trench dug by the Muslims, the siege failed. It ended in this really bitter stalemate.
Section 3. Standoff at Hudaybiyah. Now, I really want you to focus on this number, 1400. In 628 CE, which was the 6th year after the Hijra, Prophet Muhammad and roughly 1,400 of his followers marched back toward Mecca. But here's the thing. They didn't march for war. Their goal was just to peacefully perform the Umrah pilgrimage, which was this deeply important cultural and religious practice. And to really underscore their peaceful intent, they were completely unarmed. Actually, scratch that. They had standard traveling swords, but they kept them firmly sheathed.
The Quraysh, though, they didn't see a peaceful pilgrimage at all. They saw a terrifying threat to their prestige. Super alarmed by this huge show of solidarity, they immediately mobilized their forces to block the Muslims from entering the city. So the Muslims halted at a place called Hudaybiyah, just outside Mecca. The stakes here were just incredibly high. The Quraysh adamantly refused them entry, setting up this incredibly tense, potentially explosive standoff. And that is when the complex negotiations began.
Section 4. The masterstroke of diplomacy.
Okay, so at first glance, the immediate concessions in this treaty felt like a huge, embarrassing defeat. The Muslims had to turn around and go all the way back to Medina without even performing their pilgrimage that year. On top of that, any Meccan who defected to the Muslims without permission had to be returned. But, and this is a big but, Muslims defecting to Mecca would not be returned. It seems so unbelievably one-sided that some of the most prominent companions, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, were openly frustrated. But the real genius was hidden in the long-term victories. They secured a solid 10-year truce, and they gained absolute freedom for both sides to form alliances with any other Arab tribes.
The really crucial point here is how this perceived failure was understood historically by the Muslims themselves. Despite terms that felt completely unfair, the Prophet trusted the long-term vision. Our sources highlight this powerful quote from the Quran, which was revealed right around this time. "Indeed, we have given you a clear victory." That totally reframed the whole situation. It required immense patience and trust, basically signaling to everyone that these immediate concessions were actually a massive strategic victory in disguise.
And the sources point out that this treaty is a textbook example of core Islamic principles of conflict resolution in action. Instead of letting pride or ego drive them into a bloody, pointless battle right outside Mecca's gates, the Prophet prioritized dialogue. The whole approach was built on mercy and compassion, looking for a fair resolution that strictly avoided any more bloodshed. It's just as profound historical lesson in prioritizing long-term peace and stability over the immediate urge to save face or win a skirmish.
And that beautifully illustrates exactly why those initial concessions were an absolute masterstroke. Think about it. A 10-year truce finally gave the Muslims the stability they desperately needed. Without the constant, draining threat of war with the Quraysh hanging over their heads, Islam grew exponentially. That new freedom to form alliances meant that neutral tribes, who were suddenly seeing the strength and peaceful resolve of the Muslims, started flocking to ally with them. Over just the next 2 years, the entire balance of power in the region permanently shifted. The Quraysh went from being the undisputed masters of Arabia to finding themselves increasingly isolated, both politically and economically.
Section 5. A peaceful conquest.
So just 2 short years after the treaty was signed, it was broken. And crucially, it wasn't broken by the Muslims. A belligerent faction of the Quraysh actually supported a deadly attack on a tribe that was allied with the Muslims. Because the treaty was formally violated, in 630 CE, Prophet Muhammad marched on Mecca. But this time, because of the explosive growth allowed by that period of peace, he marched with an overwhelming army of 10,000 men. The Quraysh were completely outmatched and severely weakened. They basically surrendered unopposed. And then, in this incredible final act of the diplomatic mercy we were just talking about, the Prophet didn't seek any bloody revenge. He granted a sweeping, general amnesty to the inhabitants of Mecca.
What's really fascinating here is the immediate aftermath. Recognizing the shifting tides even before the conquest happened, some of the most brilliant Meccan military strategists, guys like Khalid ibn al-Walid and Amr ibn al-As, had already converted to Islam. Following the peaceful conquest, the Quraysh weren't dismantled or destroyed, they were absorbed. The Prophet recognized their undeniable organizational and financial genius. They were brought in as political partners, essentially becoming a key component of the new Muslim elite that would go on to help run the rapidly expanding Islamic State.
And that brings us right back full circle. A treaty that looked like a completely humiliating defeat on paper was, in reality, the very catalyst for ultimate success. And it was all achieved through patience, foresight, and a strict preference for peace over bloodshed. So, I'm going to leave you with this to think about. How can the power of strategic patience and nonviolent diplomacy reshape how you approach modern conflicts in your own life or leadership? You know, sometimes stepping back and yielding on those immediate, ego-driven details is the exact move you need to make to secure the future. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.